I'm going to have to revisit this week and see what happened. See how that all turned out. Well, what I know about this whole idea of compassion is that if we're not tuned into our own stuff, if we don't know our own feelings, our own emotions, and I'm kind of looking at what you're talking about, it's very hard to tap into what's going on with someone else. So it does start with know thyself, with knowing who you are, what you're feeling, how it's working for you, because if you don't know who you are, it's going to be very hard to tap into what the other is feeling or experiencing in life. I love what you said about being hardwired, because it is the truth. It is the truth. Do you know that when babies, for up until about the age of 1 year, a baby, when it hears another baby cry, or it sees a baby fall down and then become distressed, that baby feels, the baby that didn't fall, that's not crying, that baby feels distressed. That baby cries when another baby cries. It seeks comfort from the mother. It starts sucking its thumb, and it didn't even have the experience itself, you see? And then, after a year passes by, all of a sudden, the same incident can happen. A child can fall down, start crying, and by a year, the baby's going, how can I soothe? How can I take an active part in bringing comfort to this baby, this other baby that just fell down? See, we progress in our compassion. Starts with, seeking comfort ourselves, and it didn't happen to us. Then we try to actively soothe. When we're about a year old, we try to actively soothe the crying baby. We take it our blankie, we give it a teddy bear, right? We give it a toy. We try to make things better, make it all right. By late childhood, we get it that these things happen in life, that it doesn't have to be immediate. We get that there's distress and suffering beyond the immediacy of our experience. We start getting it that stuff happens, that things happen in life, and it doesn't have to happen right in front of us, but we start getting it, you see? And when we start getting it, we start feeling this compassion for the greater whole. By the time we're a teenager, hopefully, if we've made it through, right? Now we start developing the desire to start alleviating suffering, to make a difference, to do something, to be of service. See, it's a progression. And by the time you come to common ground, you're willing to spend your Sunday in the kitchen making peanut butter sandwiches so you can go out and hand them out to folks that are hungry and homeless. You see, it's a progression. But it's an inside job. It's the capacity to be present with the experience. Find where one of the resources that I read, the failure to register other people's emotions, the failure to identify with other people's situations, the failure to see the pain in a person who's lost a son, the failure to see the pain in someone who's lost a beloved, the failure to see the pain in somebody whose life is in turmoil, whose finances are a disaster, whose health is in trouble, the failure to make that connection, that tragic failing, means that we're not being fully human. When we can't connect with others in that way and feel the energy of the pain and the suffering, there's something missing in our capacity as a human being. I think that's pretty profound. I think that's very profound. So this whole idea of living a life of compassion, tapping into the soul of kindness, which is what we're talking about. You know what? Sometimes it's not even so much what you do. It's this inside job. I like what the Jewish tradition calls it, tikkun. Tikkun, those of you who come from that tradition. Repairing of seemingly separate self in the greater unity of God. It's seeing yourself in the other. It's this idea of the golden rule of not doing something to somebody else that you wouldn't want to have done to you. Like Linda said, it is the foundation of all religious traditions. This incredible compassion and kindness. Accounting, taking stock. How compassionate am I? How kind am I? How does this look in my life? The capacity to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. You know, sometimes, oh, I'd never do that. Oh my God, that would never happen to me. How could this person be like that? I would never do that. Well, the shift is there, but for the grace of God go I. That's the shift. Because anything can happen to anybody, anytime. There's always one more thing to embrace. And if your life has been just really smooth and you haven't had to experience the ups and downs and the pains and sorrows, I bless your journey. Most of us have been through stuff. Most of us may be going through stuff right now, and I know for sure some of us are going through stuff right at this moment. But the capacity to tap into the whole, to all of it, to remember that we are in this together, is what brings us our wholeness. When we are think we're just separate, that's your problem, not mine. Oh, I'm sorry you're homeless, but oh well. Sorry you're hungry, but oh well. Sorry your finances are a disaster, but oh well. When we take that perspective, we're missing our wholeness. We're missing part of our humanity. We're missing an opportunity to express our own divinity within that experience and to see the divinity of everybody else that's involved in these experiences. Sometimes life can be tough. People die. People are homeless. People are hungry. People hurt. People are not well. These things happen, see. In the Jewish tradition, there's a spiritual practice, and the foundation of the spiritual practice is bearing the burdens of others. Now, it's not so much that we go out and we take on the world, like Linda said. We do what is ours to do. We get very, very clear about doing what is ours to do, remembering that the other person has to do what is theirs to do, and some of it, most of it, we just have to give to the universe, to God, to your understanding of whatever you call that. Give it to the universe to do what the universe is going to do with it. But what we're called to do is be. Yes, we're called to do, but we are called to be within that experience, this soul of kindness, this compassionate energy in the experience. And part of it requires us just to be free of this sense of separateness. Not my problem. Oh, never happened to me. Yet. Never happened to me or mine. Yet. Always remember that word, yet. Yeah. So we have to be real self-aware. And the more self-aware we are, the more open we are to other people's experiences. The more open we are to sense the energy of sorrow, to sense the energy of pain, to look beyond the surface, to respond to those subtle cues. Sometimes it's not so subtle. Sometimes we see weeping and we weep too. And we are very clear about what the weeping is about. But sometimes we have to be tapped in to the subtleties of the experience. We've got to be present enough to look beneath whatever is going on so that we can actually, I do remember the part about you being crappy. To look beyond it and go, like Linda said, that's not who she normally is. Something else is going on, to see beneath, to see the facial expression, to see the pain. It's not right there, but to see it, to look beneath it. And boy, I'll tell you what, when we stand back and judge, when my son was very first getting sober, David, I'm telling on you, David has 27 years of sobriety now. When my son was first getting sober, and it was kind of a rocky time, I gotta say. It was a little bit, and because I was getting sober at the very same time, so it was a little dicey. And but I used to see homeless young men about my son's age on the street, and I used to think, oh, good God, that could be my son. That could be my son. Now, my son was in recovery, but there was a part of me that didn't judge that child because I went, that could be my son. That could be my son. And so I've always, because I know some of it is your sons. I know that. I know it's some of your own sons. But what I know about this is that when I tap into that place of myself that helps me see the other person as my own or as myself, it changes everything. It just absolutely changes everything. Because if I'm only identifying with me and my little story, me and my little world, I'm missing a huge piece of the puzzle. A huge piece of the puzzle. And I want to tell you something. It requires us to be calm enough and so receptive enough when we're experiencing these things, number one, that we don't collapse into it, that we don't collapse into the sorrow and the suffering of the world. Because I got to tell you something. There's something called compassion burnout. Compassion burnout, where we get so overwhelmed with the pain and suffering of the world that we just want to go and pull the covers over our head and never go outside of our home. Do you know what I'm talking about? Life gets so hard. But the capacity to be centered enough to remember our wholeness enough, to remember this repairing of our seemingly separate self, like the tikkun olam idea, that we get it, that we're all part of this greater unity of God. To be able to move into that, it allows us to be present in a way that we can do what is ours to do, but most of all, we can be who we are called to be within that experience, without judgment, with acceptance, with presence, with alignment, with the divine nature of all of whatever is going on, and tune into the subtleties of the experience so that we're not tone deaf to emotions. Emotionally tone deaf is a big deal. And I think sometimes it's easier to tune into the emotions and the pain and the suffering of a certain circumstance than it is of another. And so I just want to throw out a word, and what I'd like you to do is pay attention to your reaction. Pay attention to your thoughts. Pay attention to what comes up for you when you hear these words. Ariel Castro. Ariel Castro, the gentleman that kept those 3 young women captive for all those years and then committed suicide. Had a conversation with someone about this, and I was surprised at the energy around it. See, we don't get to be compassionate in some cases and not in others. Just a thought. You know how your gut reacted to that, those words, and who that person is. See, we have to learn not to be emotionally tone deaf, because if we're going to be tone deaf to one, we might be tone deaf to more than one. Does that make sense? So here's your invitation. Remember that with compassion, there is this invisible exchange of energy. Whether we do anything or not, whether we step out there and do what is ours to do or not, when we come from this place of deep compassion, this deep resonant field of remembering the truth of who we are and of who the other is, when we come from that place, there is this invisible power of grace that moves between our hearts. There's an invisible power of grace between the giver of compassion and the receiver of compassion. And guess what, folks? It's all one. The giver and the receiver become one. There is this incredible energy of grace. So here's your invitation. Remember that it takes very little to make a difference in somebody else's life. Very little. The kindness that Glenda was talking about, those little random acts of kindness, it takes very little to make a profound difference in someone's day. Remember that if you're failing to register other folks' pain and suffering, if you're failing to recognize the subtleties of the experience, there's a tragic failing in what it means to be human. There's a tragic failing in having an opportunity to see the divinity, to be the divinity within the experience. And the capacity to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to be moved by other folks and their circumstances, that's what makes us whole. That's what brings us to this alignment of our humanity and our divinity, and lets us move into that place where we can actually create this invisible power of grace that flows between me and you and you and me. Thank you for listening.